and get back to a period when I think the U.S. can kind of dominate that global export market. How's it going, YouTube? This is Matthew Kruse at Comstock Investments. I want to focus a little bit on some of the yield results that we're hearing and how that will make some changes to the potential ending stock scenario before I kind of shift over to what we're hearing with the Brazil crop that's at the initial stage of being planted. So it seems like some of the general thoughts on U.S. crop size is that it's continuing to get a little bit smaller. A lot of people talking about yield isn't quite there. And you kind of have to keep in mind that that's still based on record yields or extremely high yields, approaching 99 million planted acres, over 90 million harvested acres. And so it still means a very large crop, a record crop. We're talking about 16.8 billion bushels. Now, you could argue that, if you continue to shave off a couple of bushels per acre in the corn, maybe it's closer to 16.5 or 16.6 billion bushels, but it's still a large crop that's starting right now, and it's going to hit us all at once. And you compare that to the last record of 2023 at 15.3, you're still talking a billion bushels or more than the previous record. It's still a large corn crop that the market has to be able to digest, and you're going to, see basis weak in a lot of areas. And we're hearing a lot of stories about grain storage is very popular right now, that they can't keep up with the demand because we don't have places for everybody to put it right now. And so, last year at this time, we saw prices recede about 30 cents beginning around October 2nd, all the way through the end of November, early December, where it basically had to get the harvest behind us before we kind of started a multi-month rally that eventually saw us get back to $5. And I think that's maybe what we're going to see happen again, potentially, where it's going to be hard for the market to rally. Even if we do see yield kind of continue to get lower, we can't just focus on yield, right? We still have there's other factors like demand. And that's the other thing that I kind of want to point out is that coinciding with our record production, the USDA is projecting record demand in exports and feed demand. And so we need that to kind of remain true and keep our foot on the gas pedal in terms of those exports, because we need to be able to burn through all this crop that we're producing. Talking about rainfall right now, we're seeing rainfall come back in parts of central Missouri and the eastern Corn Belt that were extremely dry, 2 to 3 inches. But at this stage of the game, it's kind of too little too late. I don't see it helping or benefiting the crop very much. Now, potentially it could eventually find its way down into the Mississippi, which we've seen those river levels diminish here in the last month or more. And so potentially it could bring back those levels, which will be important to our export to the Gulf, of course. I wanted to highlight some yield reports that we've been getting back. I talked to one grower in southern Ontario, which is north of Ohio, which has also been extremely dry. And they said that on their good soils, that yields have been off 50 bushels per acre. And on their light soils, light sands, it's almost zero in extreme cases. And one example in Northwest Iowa, in my home territory, there a test strip that did not have fungicide on it did over 30 bushels per acre less than the rest of the field. And so at least in that case, it looks like the fungicide paid for itself real easily. So I just want to play around with a couple of options here in our ending stock scenario. So this is where that we were most recently with the USDA September update. They reduced the corn yield by 186 from 188 to 186.7 bushels per acre, but they increased the planted acres and the harvested acres, almost in the 99 million acres in planted acres. That's how we get to that 16.8 billion bushels in production. Now you can play around with this and let's bring this down to 185. Let's start with that. Now that just takes us down to 16.6 billion bushels. So shaves off a couple 200 million bushels, which does help a little bit. But what if, they're also projecting this record demand? That's what I wanted to highlight here, that they've got us ratcheted up on exports to almost 3 billion bushels. Now, I'm not saying that's not going to happen, but it would be record exports, and it comes at a time where we're still in the middle of trade war discussions. And I think it affects the soybean market quite a bit more, but I don't think the corn market is completely immune to that either. Now, starting out, they've been very strong, but there's a long ways to go, right? And we're kind of in the middle of Brazil's peak export season too. And so I'd like to get past that to the point where Brazil has kind of depleted their excess corn inventory on the global market and get back to a period when I think the US can kind of dominate that global export market. But that's several months away yet before that happens. Talking about feed and residual as well, a pretty lofty goal there. Now, not to say that that can't happen, but some think this might be a little bit overstated. So if you play around with those numbers here and we reduce that to 5.9 billion bushels, I mean, that'd still be a large amount historically, but it still makes a big difference on the bottom line, adding to the ending stocks. And so you go back up here with, if we reduce the yield to 182, that's really where we need the yield to get back down to, just to get us back to par, really, based on this situation. And so, keep in mind, when we reduce yield, everyone's looking for a rally. Well, if you have a rally, prices go up, demand generally suffers, right? Because prices are more expensive. And so, that's kind of the caveat or offset to that. And so we kind of want our cake and eat it too. We want yield to drop, but we want, demand to continue to increase. And so we really need, if we can maintain these levels, let's see here, that's where things get interesting. But I guess that's what I'm a little bit skeptical on. Can we hit these record export, record demand levels that we're seeing? I'm a little bit more friendly to the ethanol market. I haven't touched about that on that much. I think the ethanol demand is there. Crude prices are kind of staying sideways, which isn't necessarily positive, but it's not a negative either. Let's switch to soybeans here. In the case of soybeans, this is where we're at for the September report, the most recent one, yield of 53.5. Now, if we shave off half a bushel, which is certainly possible considering some of the dryness in the eastern corn belt, it helps a little bit. It's down to this 4.25 billion bushel level. Crushings have been very strong, so I don't necessarily have a problem with that so much, but obviously it's the exports that are the big issue there, that I think we've already lost several hundred million bushels in the export market. Now, some of that can be replaced by other countries, but not all of it. We can't replace China like we can a little bit more easily in the case of the corn. And so I think you could easily look for 200 to 300 million loss or drop in exports, and that's where it really starts to add up. Where 300 million bushels historically is not super tight, but relatively low ending stocks. But adding 200 million takes us up to 500 million bushels in ending carryover, and it's going to be hard for prices to rally beyond that point. I'm going to shift gears here and talk a little bit about the Brazil's 25-26 soybean planting season that is just now getting started. You're going to see a lot of discussion and attention focused on that. I guess first thing I would say, it's still very early. That October month and early November is a much more important crop planting month in Brazil than it is September. And so they've only got like 1% or 2% of the crop in right now. 70% of that crop is planted historically between October 6th to late November. And so it's still very early, but farmers there they're always trying to plant a little bit earlier than the previous year, assuming weather allows that. And that's what we're looking at. What do we see in forecast? Does it even allow for an earlier planting window? And I would say right now, not necessarily. It seems like it's on time. I wouldn't say, it's certainly not late, at least not yet, but I don't know that I'd say that it's anything all that too early, but time will tell. It kind of depends a little bit on the risk appetite of the growers there. If some, are willing to plant in the dust because they want to get the crop in early. I talked to one grower yesterday, actually, in central Mato Grosso. They plant 50,000 acres, and they already started planting soybeans on September 15th in pretty dry conditions, but they're hopeful that the rain will come. And part of the reason for that is because they want to be harvesting those beans already by Christmas, and then come in and plant their second crop corn right behind it. And that's really the goal, is to, without hurting the bean yield too much, they want to be able to get those beans planted in and get them out even quicker, so they can give more time for that second crop corn to kind of flourish that follows that. And the earlier they get that in, the more full yield potential that it has. And so that's why they want to get that all planted by January if possible, but not everyone does. So this is kind of the rainfall starting out this season. You kind of see here that we're coming off of the dry season, and we're looking for the start to the monsoon. That's what Eric Snodgrass calls it, the monsoon. I call it the rainy season, but it's basically the monsoon coming back. And so far they're maybe getting an inch on average in Mato Grosso, which is still below average. Look for 2 inches, but you can kind of see over time here in October, they get closer to 4 inches, and then, closer to 7 inches in November. And so looking out ahead, I think it'll ratchet up. It's just a matter of time. But as I said before, some growers wait until they get at least 3 inches of rain. And their reasoning is because sometimes the rainy season can do a head fake. You can get a little rain, and then it can turn dry again for a couple of weeks. And the problem is if you start planting right away, poor germination. And so, because there's no soil moisture in the profile. And so a lot of them wait for a few inches to kind of build up to give him a little bit of a buffer in case it turns dry. But this is what we're seeing here in at least through the first week of October. And this is what we're focused on here in the center west region is arguably where the bulk of the soybean production is. It's below average. Now you see here in the northwest part of Mato Grosso, they're going to get above average, but that's only one part of the state. And it's not even where the bulk of the beans are planted in that state. And so, I don't see anything here to kind of suggest that, oh boy, it's just going to start raining, cats and dogs here right away. And so it doesn't mean that people won't start getting planting, but I don't see anything starting any too early. But there's still time for that. And this GFS model kind of confirms the same thing, that below average rainfall through October 5th for the most part. And so we'll just have to wait and see. There's still plenty of time for the crop to get in. And so I think as long as rainfall starts coming in here later in October, I think they can have an on-time planting. So that's what I have for you today. Thank you and have a good day.
Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and/or options is substantial, and each investor and/or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.